Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwald. Christian churches in America are experiencing many challenges and changes in the 21st century, and some are experiencing declines of membership and participation. The United Methodist Church is one tradition that is facing some critical issues at present and will be asking difficult questions in the near future. My guest today, the Reverend Tim Burleson, has been involved in ministry for over 50 years and is currently pastoring two Methodist churches. He will help us understand the changes and challenges facing the Methodist Church in America. Welcome, Reverend Burleson.
Thank you, Dr. Oswald. It's a pleasure to be here.
May I call you Tim?
Please.
Okay, all right. You have a really interesting ministry record. And I'd like for you just to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, because you're also a proud alum of Appalachian State University.
Glad you saw my pen. Yes.
Yeah, and I want to let everybody know that you drove all the way up from Myrtle Beach today and driving home tonight just to be with us. So I thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
So I want you to tell me a little bit about your chaplaincy with the AMA Superbike circuit, but just introduce yourself however you want, and I'm really interested to hear about your ministry.
Okay, thank you. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina. I came to Appalachian, and during my college years, I had a hard time finding a place that I could call home academically. But when I transferred in to App in 1974, I immediately found home and stayed here and graduated. Loved, now I grew up in Asheville, so I'm familiar with the mountains, pretty high mountains where we are too, but just the atmosphere here, it felt like being on a camping trip 24/7, and I love to camp. So, but I fell in love with App, and anyone who's around me any length of time will tell you that love has never gone away.
Right.
But then from App, I went to graduate school at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Graduated there in 1979 with a degree in religious education, and went out about pastoring. There was a movement about that time, and it was called to the small, being called to the smaller churches, and I kind of felt that call. People urged me to get on the fast track, if you would, but I felt more comfortable with smaller churches because I can get to know the people. And that's very important in pastoral care, to get to know people. And speaking of pastoral care, I did enough extra work over the years, seminary work and clinical pastoral education work, to basically become now qualified as an MDiv equivalent. So, my years in the pastorate early were interesting. I've pastored mountain churches. I've pastored a First Baptist church in the South Carolina Low Country, and went through some trials, went through some difficulties, went through a divorce, and kind of had to, the term they use now is reconstruction or deconstruction and reconstruction of faith. I kind of had to do that because I was raised in a bit of a hyper-Calvinist background and had to go back and relearn what grace was.
Right.
And that took me a while.
Is that why you ultimately ended up as a Methodist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is, actually. United Methodist Church and Wesley's interpretation of grace and his 3 points of grace touched me on a level that nothing in my former churches ever did. And I found a home there in the United Methodist Church. Now, did venture back into it's kind of considered the moderate Baptist church, the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And I pastored there. That was my first Baptist church experience. And it was interesting. They embraced a lot of Wesleyan tradition, but there was still some of the Calvinism from the Baptist side still there. I retired in 2018, moved to the coast, which is, I have this dichotomy in me. I'm wondering, I love the mountains, but I also love the beach. No, wait, you love the mountain. You know, it's a pleasant dichotomy.
All right.
I retired to the beach, but then 6 months later, and I didn't think this would ever happen, 6 months later, I felt the urge to preach again. So I got back in touch with the district superintendent, and he said this: I have 2 churches. I said, I'll take one. And it eventually became 2. But I got back in it and have been pastoring again for 4 years. And I'm enjoying the preaching. I'm still enjoying the preaching. I'm enjoying the pastoral care, again, because I still pastor 2 small churches, and we'll get into that, I guess, a little bit later. But somewhere in the middle there, I found myself involved in sports chaplaincy.
Yeah, and this is a field that I've never heard of before meeting you.
Sure.
I know that college teams have chaplains sometimes, but I've never thought about a motorcycle circuit, a racing circuit, having a chaplain, and that's incredibly interesting to me.
It was interesting, and it was such an out-of-the-box ministry that I almost felt like I was writing the book on how to do it. I went in with just my pastoral experience and my seminary training and my wit. And a lot of times I worked off the seat of my pants because it was like, okay, they did not teach me how to do this at Southeastern Seminary. I got to figure out how to do it. And we did. It was very much an out-of-the-box ministry. It was a very extraordinary ministry. There are things that we did there. And I say we, my wife and I worked through an organization called Motor Racing Outreach out of Charlotte. They provide NASCAR's chaplains, and I worked through them, although I was an independent contractor and pretty much working for myself. But that ministry taught me a lot of things. It taught me, for one thing, about inclusion, and I think we're going to get into that again in a little while.
Right.
This week, as you know, I know you're a motorcycle fan. This week, the week that we're taping, this is the week of the Daytona 200. And I've been the chaplain for about a dozen of those. And I led the prayer, and I did the pastoral care and everything that was there. And being around those folks from different religious backgrounds, some no religious backgrounds, some Catholic, some Protestant, some Orthodox, that taught me an awful lot, again, about the grace of God and how inclusive it is. And I came up with a metaphor for that. And again, and I related to the 200. In the 200 this Saturday, I believe I read they've got 62 entries. And those 62 entries will be racing Kawasaki's, Hondas, Suzuki's. I don't think they'll be racing any Harleys, Ducatis. And in years past, they used to race the old BSA bikes.
Right.
They're different colors. They're different tire vendors, although I think AMA Pro now has one dedicated tire vendor. Different suspension people, but there's no race unless they all come together.
And they're all welcome.
And they're all welcome. Yeah, it doesn't matter. And we, in the 200 this year, there will be racers from 18 years old to, I know, a former 4-time AMA Superbike champion who's going to try to win the 200 for the first time. He's going to be there. And there will be racers from at least a dozen countries there trying to win the Rolex watch, which they give away to the Daytona champion and to the Rolex 24 Daytona champion. And it's very exciting to watch, but at the end of it, you think, you know, if it was all Suzuki's, if it was all Hondas, if it was all Ducatis.
That's actually a great analogy for inclusion.
Yes.
And I do want to talk about that, and that might be as good a segue as we get. I'm really interested in the whole concept of chaplaincy because, as you mentioned, you've got to be conversant with many different traditions and available to people from many different traditions. And that must be a challenge in and of itself.
It is, but it was a fun challenge to embrace. We had one team in AMA Superbike made up primarily of Muslim. And I reached out to them and I said, do you want me to set you up a prayer room? I said, I'm familiar with your faith. I respect your faith. It's an Abrahamic faith. It comes from the same roots as mine and the Hebrew faith. So I want to help you practice your faith. And they were surprised but thankful. They didn't think a Protestant Christian chaplain would reach out to them. And it surprised them. And I was glad to be able to do that. But Dr. Oswald, I had a very funny conversation with one gentleman He asked me, we were talking, a pastoral conversation in the race paddock, and he said to me, he said, now, Chaplain, I want more to tell you up ahead of time now, I'm Jewish. And I said, well, last I looked, Jesus was too. And so I said, if you want to come to my chapel service, you are more than welcome. Mm-hmm. So it was a challenge, but in that, I saw grace in a ton of places. Mm-hmm. I had the privilege of baptizing some children, which in the Baptist tradition from whence I came, we didn't do. But I was glad to do it. And we did some weddings. Also, unfortunately, as you can imagine, motorcycle racing is dangerous. Mm-hmm. We had deaths, and I did some funerals. Mm. And I did some weddings. Recently, I did one for a couple down in Kershaw County, a couple that met at the racetrack. She was an amateur women's champion on the 600. And I always picked on her about, I'd call her name, I'd say, Jess, you're a national champion. And she would grin from ear to ear. Also a very smart lady. She studied philosophy and psychology in college. She and I could converse and understand each other. Right. But I did their wedding, and it was a joyful event. And I still occasionally get a call from them, say, Chaplain. Yeah. I'll say, go ahead, call me that. I'm cool. Yeah. But I've got this problem. I don't understand this verse of Scripture. Can you help me? Sure. How much time you got? And I will still continue occasionally. Those calls are getting fewer and far between because they replaced me with a team of chaplains, which I guess should be a compliment.
That should be a compliment.
But
that's right.
I think they got now 2 or 3 guys doing what I did as one guy. But it was a very unique ministry, and it taught me how to be a pastor again, because getting back into the pastorate, I had an experience with diversity and unity within that diversity. And that's been one of the hallmarks of the traditional United Methodist Church. Mm-hmm. So that allowed me to slip into the Methodist Church rather seamlessly.
Well, that's a great segue. So I want to pick up on that, because you've used terms like inclusion,
sure, grace,
unity, diversity. And these are terms, I think, that are relevant for what's going on in the United Methodist Church right now. Observers will note that the UMC is in the middle of probably a split, well, actually a split that is going on.
Yes.
And those terms are relevant. Could you maybe describe the issues at stake here with this breaking apart of the Methodist Church into the Global Methodist Church
Global Methodist
and
Church,
United Methodist Church?
And the United Methodist Church. And this afternoon, as I ate lunch at Farm Cafe, and I love that place. So let me give them a check mark. I was sitting there eating and reading. They're also breaking off into those groups you mentioned, but a large UMC church in Arkansas is breaking into 3 parts, because some churches do not want to affiliate. Some will stay with the UMC, which is more traditional, progressive, kind of leaning toward process theology. Then you've got the Calvinist group that want to keep the original language about LGBTQ inclusion and not allowing LGBTQ folks into positions of leadership. And then you've got the traditional version, or the non-denominational version, and my take on them is they're just tired of fighting. They just want to get away and do their thing, do their ministry.
Right.
And when I read that, I thought, now that's a creative way. If you're going to split, that's a creative way to do it. I see some similarities in what's going on in the UMC, in what happened, and you and I both went through this when the Southern Baptists split. Southern Baptists split, and United Methodists always find this funny. One of the issues that they split over was the role of women in the pulpit.
Right.
And in the UMC, that I tell them that, and they go, seriously?
Yeah.
Because it doesn't matter whatever branch of Methodism you are. There are women in the pulpit. There are women in mission fields. There are women bishops. They don't have a problem with it. But in the mid-'80s, that was one of the problems. And trying to think of the other one. There were two major ones. Anyway, they split. They broke up into 3 groups. And my observation in hindsight is that it was as much about power as anything.
Sure.
One group had it, Another group wanted it. I did some of my own research on that, and I'll get to the Methodist Church because I see there's so many similarities. Baptist Church split began over in a meeting over cafe au lait and beignets in New Orleans in 1967. They wrote out on napkins their plan, and by 1985 they had succeeded. And they split. They basically came in and took over. Now, in the United Methodist Church, it was the other way around. The UMC was founded in 1968 as a merged group. Church of the Brethren and the U.S. Methodist Church came together to form the UMC.
Right.
But there was one little thing hanging in there that they couldn't come to full agreement over, and that was what to do with what we call today LGBTQ.
So
but
that's been an issue since 1968?
Since 1968.
Okay.
But they were able to live with one another. They were able to worship together, able to minister together. They found unity despite it. But I think the for lack of a better term, the power syndrome kind of raised its head. And the folks in the global church, which is the more conservative group, they decided that they kind of wanted power over what they did instead of having the UMC tell them what to do. So again, there's that little power dynamic. But and it began to fester a good bit in the last 10 years.
Yeah. So just to kind of get to the issue, as I
Sure.
understand it, there is a book of discipline
Yes, sir.
for the United Methodist
Sure.
Church which outlines beliefs and practices.
Sure.
And, there is a very nice inclusive statement in the book of discipline that welcomes all people of all races, all orientations, all ethnicities, and so forth. But then there are two statements that I think are at the crux of the issue. And one of the statements in the book of discipline does not allow ordination of LGBTQ folks.
Correct.
And the other statement does not recognize marriage, or will not allow
Permission to
marry LGBTQ couples, same-sex couples.
Sure.
So the global, seeing the writing on the wall that the UMC Church is moving toward a more inclusive position, the global Methodists have broken away to be more traditional.
Yes.
Okay.
That's pretty much it.
Okay.
And as I said before, there are a bunch of churches, I don't know exactly how many, but there are a large number who are saying, we've had it with the fight, we're not going to affiliate with either, but we're going to keep our church. So we're seeing that tripartite breakup.
Right. So it's a little bit jarring to me when I read the book of discipline that even though the UMC Church is moving toward a more inclusive position, that they still have those two statements of exclusion. So why not get rid of those and make a positive statement about inclusion?
Well, they tried.
Okay.
But they caught, use a World War II term my dad talked about a lot, they caught a lot of flack. The folks who ended up breaking away in the global church said that that was not scriptural. They could not abide by that. And so when they could not force the UMC I'm getting ahead of myself. The UMC tried to put that inclusive language in.
Right.
But those who broke up and are now in the global church said no. And COVID intervened. There were going to be general conferences, but COVID intervened, and there was going to be votes on the inclusion statement. They did have one general conference where the inclusion statement failed, and there was supposed to be a general conference in 2020, but COVID ruined it. COVID kept everybody from coming, and part of the reason was folks couldn't get visas, because the United Methodist Church is worldwide, it's global.
Right.
Folks couldn't get visas, so they couldn't come and deal with the issue. So finally the global church said, okay, we're done. We're going to go start our own group.
Right.
And last May they did. So, but I think once the dust is settled and the General Conference reconvenes in 2024, I think you will see that inclusive language, because we're the more progressive church wing of the Methodist Church, and I identify with that wing. That more progressive wing wants to be more inclusive, wants to be more welcoming, wants to show the gospel as being more come as you are, be who you are, and we will accept you in. We will, if you're called, we will ordain you. We will educate you. We will support you. Now, I have a personal stake in this as well. As all this was happening, one of my children transgendered, and I was kind of going through that, and I had to reach a decision of conscience at that point. And this is one of the reasons I'm staying with the UMC. I could not, in good conscience, and with my understanding of scriptural grace and understanding of grace as Mr. Wesley described it, I could not be a part of a fellowship that would not give my child full rights. So I have a personal stake in it as well.
I wonder, since you bring in that personal element, what you would tell someone from the LGBTQ community if they were to want to affiliate with the Methodist Church, yet read this language in the Book of Discipline, which seems to be at odds with the position the UMC has taken, because it doesn't give folks from that community full rights at this point.
Sure.
How would you talk to that person about inclusion or what the Book of Discipline says?
I would ask them to be patient because it will be dealt with again. It will come again. It will come up again because that ideal has not died. It is still alive and well. And I think one reason that the global church left is to say, okay, we'll do things our way, so you can do things your way, and let's work together where we can, but where we can't, see you.
Is there not another general conference before 2024?
They are only held on a quadrennial level. They wanted to have one in 2020 because of COVID, couldn't. 2020, they postponed it till 2022. COVID kept it out. And so now 2024 is the next scheduled. And I think that's the one where it's going to be addressed.
Okay.
The inclusion, the issue is going to be addressed. And I think we'll see some changes. So I would tell folks from the LGBT community who want full inclusion in United Methodist Church, hang on, be patient. Rome wasn't built in a day. It took the Israelites 40 years to get to the promised land. Hold on,
right?
Because I can see it coming.
Yeah, I could see how some people would begin to lose patience. Though.
Sure.
It appears that this has been an issue that's been, I don't want to say kicking the can down the road, but pushing it out further and further and further.
Right.
And now it's 2023, so there's a whole nother
Sure.
more than a year before this is going to come up. So,
Sure.
I wonder if there are elements within the church who might say this needs to be done now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's also, and I agree, I agree, and that relates to I see you have the Book of Discipline up here. Anticipating this. In 2019, there was another paragraph added to the discipline. It's called paragraph 2553, where guidance was given from the General Conference that was called, I believe, into a quick session or maybe a Zoom session that lays out how churches can separate and do so in grace, how the Global Methodist Church can separate and do so with grace, and the United Methodist Church has promised to help them financially as they do so. But 2553 has created its own bit of controversy because for smaller church, like the ones I pastor, they have to pay a couple of years of apportionments, which you and I are Baptists, that's the same as the cooperative program. They have to pay 2 years of apportionments. They have to continue to pay into the minister's retirement fund. There's a financial requirement. Now, some Methodist churches around the country have gone to court over that, and I think some have won. And what we're seeing in South Carolina, in the South Carolina Conference, there are a lot of churches, UMC churches in South Carolina, however, many of them are the size of my churches. My churches will average in attendance, my smallest one has 8 to 10. my largest one. This past Sunday we had 20, and we thought the Lord had come back. I mean, everybody was excited. We thought, wow, look what's going on here. But both of those churches, if they wanted to get out, wouldn't have the money to do it. So that debate is now raging.
Right.
How can the smaller churches that don't have the big financial backing or the means to pull out, how can they do that?
Right.
I'm not going to identify my churches. I'll just say they're two of the sweetest churches I've ever been a part of. I love them. They've adopted one. My wife is one of them, but one of them expressed to me an opinion 2 or 3 weeks ago. They said, if we wanted to leave, we couldn't, Pastor, because we don't have the money.
Right.
And I understood that. I said, I hear you. I hear you.
So in the Global Methodist Church, which is broken away now, you had mentioned that their primary reason is that they don't believe the current direction of the UMC is scriptural.
Correct.
On the LGBTQ issue.
Correct.
But it's my understanding that Methodism has always had this kind of quadrilateral approach to applying ethics in the world, that Scripture is important, tradition is important, experience is important, and reason.
Reason, right.
And it seems to me that it's that last thing, reason now. We have a much more sophisticated understanding of human sexuality and gender now. And if we apply that understanding, it would seem to me that it would counterbalance the scriptural argument, which it seems to take a pretty narrow interpretation of Scripture anyway to be exclusive.
And I agree with you 100%. I did some of my own research on this, and I'm thankful. My wife is a retired registered nurse, and she helped me with this. And I came to see and understand that human sexuality is determined at the end of the first trimester. At the beginning of the second trimester, it is determined. But in that first trimester, it's not set. And at the second trimester, whether you're going to be male or female, gay or straight, that's when it's determined. And with that scientific backing, that's where the concept of reason, and that's called the Wesley quadrilateral, what you spoke of, the essence of that one point of reason seems to be a point that needs to be emphasized. The United Methodist Church is very quick to embrace the advances of science. And that's another thing I like about it. I have a lifelong love of astronomy and physics, and I can read about the Big Bang. I can read about those things and go, oh, wow, God is so cool. Is that how God did it? And just be willing to embrace science and my thought all along on this is God did what only God can do, but science's job is to tell us how it happened.
Yeah. Well, that's I think that's an enlightened perspective, and I hope that's the perspective that can help bring these issues to some sort of resolution next year.
Too.
And I appreciate you being so open and honest and being willing to talk about these very divisive topics today. And it's helped me to understand what the UMC is doing right now, what's going through.
Well,
so,
thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I wear my pin proudly. Appalachian gave so much to me back in the 70s, and this is, to me, a way of saying thank you.
Well, thank you, and I hope you have a safe trip home.
Thank you, sir. I plan to drive carefully. My
right.
wife will get me if I don't.
Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. My thanks to my guest, Dr. Reverend Tim Burleson, and hope you'll join us next week here on App TV as we continue to explore the relationship between religion, culture, and society. Until then, this is Ozzy Ostwald.